Good morning. Thanks for the invitation to be here. I want to first thank former Senior Associate Dean Chip Reynolds for introducing me to this population. I feel like a bit out of water, a fish out of water. I'm basically a pediatric neuropsychologist. So to be dealing with adult learning disability was an interesting change for me. And more years ago than I'd like to remember, Dr. Reynolds came across a case of a medical student who was in dire straits, asked for an evaluation, and from that point onward, I've been basically providing consultations to the medical school, typically about 5 to 6 students per year. So let's talk about LD per se. Some general statements. The essence of a learning disability is a learning rate that's significantly below expectations. We're not talking about garden variety underachievement here. We're talking about significant limitations in core academic skill competencies. For example, a youngster entering the 5th grade with 2nd grade reading ability is truly in dire straits. This represents a diverse group of disorders that are accompanied by selective information processing deficits. I'm not good at cartoons or drawing on PowerPoint, so I don't have interconnecting lines. But we're going to be talking about basically processing deficits at 2 levels. At the input stage, being able to assimilate all relevant information, as well as monitoring and output. In between, we've got modality-specific information processing skills that can be disrupted as a function of our learning disorders. The etiologies are multifactorial and are heavily genetically loaded. For reading disabilities, there are already 7 candidate genes that have been identified. The evolution of the concept of learning disorder actually began in the early 1960s at a conference that was designed to help differentiate learning disorders from then minimal brain dysfunction. The first identification of reading disorder was actually established in 1896 and 1897. So these are conditions that have been recognized, but in that 100 years, we still don't have a definitive defining criteria. Lots of societies have their own working definition of learning disorders, and we're going to be working mainly from DSM. DSM is going to change in a couple of weeks, and we've got some definite revisions around the original criteria that we'll talk about near the end of the discussion. But basically, DSM identified 4 areas that can be limited in youngsters with learning disorders. Key issue here is these are disorders that were identified in the early developmental period, childhood and adolescence. So by definition, these aren't supposed to be conditions that we're identifying in adult students, by definition. But we're going to debunk that mythology very, very quickly for you. We're not only dealing with a lag in a specific area of academic functioning, like reading, math, or writing abilities, but that is significantly interfering with that individual's capacity to perform major life activities. There are rule-out criteria. It's not due to other sensory deficits, and DSM recognizes that it can be accompanied by a variety of other problems. We're going to significantly expand upon the limited vulnerabilities that were identified in DSM. I'm going to offer you a synthesis of all of those societies and governmental bodies that have come together to try to define a learning disability. Robert Mapu in Maryland is one of the few people that has written extensively on adult ADHD. And I think it's important for us to take these points individually. A learning disability is a neurodevelopmental disorder affecting specific academic and cognitive skills. And these deficits are occurring in an otherwise intact CNS system. The specific impairments are presumed to be due to dysfunction of the brain and have been present since birth. So we have taken academic deficits and we're neurologizing their etiology. That's something that didn't occur 20, 30, 40 years ago. Although most learning disabilities affect academic skills, it's these specific information processing areas that are actually dysfunctional. Now, MAPU is talking about LD coexisting. I would make the argument that these are the underlying factors that are actually causative. A learning disability substantially limits functioning in one or more areas of a person's life. That's flagged in red because when we go from DSM, which is defining a disorder, to government legislation that defines a disability, this is a key factor that we have to pay attention to. And then we deal with our rule-out criteria. It's not explained by any neurological disorder, and it's not due to other factors that can limit an individual's ability to acquire information in school life. Prevalence. The other major book that has been written about adult ADHD actually comes from 3 former or present members of faculty here at the University of Pittsburgh. Linda Katz used to run the psychiatric rehabilitation service at Western Psych. She went on to become the president of Landmark University, one of the few schools that's dedicated exclusively to the teaching of LD ADHD students. She's now retired from that position, and she was a neuropsychologist. The other author is Jerry Goldstein, my mentor for 3 years of postdoc, and a colleague, Sue Beers. They established that approximately 3 to 20%, good deal of bandwidth there in terms of how prevalent is adult ADHD. And we're going to see an asymmetric distribution of adult ADHD as a function of where you're learning. Much less in higher education and disproportionately larger numbers of adult ADHD in Job Corps, adult basic education, trades, those kinds of academic programs. Now, in surveys completed in the early 90s, only between 2 and 4% of students with learning disabilities were making it into college. Since the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990, we've got more than a generation that have matriculated through refinements in support services that have been designed for students with educational difficulties, learning disabilities. And we've gone from 2 to 4% to nearly 15% that are now enrolled in college. So nearly a 3-fold increase. And of that, nearly 3% carry dual diagnoses of multiple learning disabilities or learning disability plus ADHD. Key factor that I'm going to emphasize over and over again is diagnosis typically is supposed to occur in childhood and adolescence, strongly emphasized by DSM. But there was something interesting that came out of a Dartmouth alumni review magazine. They took their entire population of LD students and discovered that it's a pretty bright bunch. IQ of 122, superior range, very respectable verbal and math SAT scores. Not the kinds of things that you would expect in a quote-unquote typical LD population. Bright people, twice exceptional. Key factor I want to impress on you is this was the entire population of Dartmouth LD. Key factor here is half of those students weren't identified until they crashed and burned in their freshman or sophomore year. So we're debunking a mythology that this only occurs in youngsters. Key factor is the higher your IQ, the more success you've found in basic ed, the later we're going to catch you. And it might not occur until you're doing a dissertation or until you've moved through your baccalaureate degree and moved into medical school. Going back to the Katz et al. Book, they looked at the prevalence of specific learning disorders within adults, and by far the predominant disability is one related to reading. So we're going to bypass the other factors that contribute to LD and focus mainly on reading disorders. And we're going to be focusing on ADHD. To the extent you want me to address any of the other learning differences, we can talk about that at the end. When we're looking at outcomes associated with typical college students, especially pre-ADA, dismal outcomes. Despite billions being invested in special education services, retention and graduation rates of students with LD are exceedingly poor. Most LD students matriculate into two-year programs. Few were moving on to actual baccalaureate degrees. Up to two-thirds were dropping out. Very few of them were matriculating on to graduate school. Now, what are the factors that tend to limit academic success of LD students? Big factor is comorbidity, and that's why we're going to be focusing heavily on reading and ADHD. They frequently coexist. Of the 3 to 5% of children that are identified with ADHD, 1 in 4 are going to carry a specific learning disorder diagnosis. Now, what I'm differentiating here is ADHD, by definition, is going to have associated with it very significant academic challenges. Dropout rates are high. The probability of repeating a grade extremely high. So we're not talking about the underachievement that coexists with ADHD. We're talking about an actual LD diagnosis coexisting with it. Of the children diagnosed with LD, 1 in 3 are going to have coexisting ADHD. Now, concern is we've got a listing of DSM Axis 1 diagnoses that frequently coexist with these conditions. A factor that really stymies differential diagnosis is any of those conditions in and of themselves can significantly impact academic functioning, and all of those conditions can very easily imitate ADHD. So the refinement of differential diagnosis is an exercise of multiple rule-outs and complex assessment. College students just presenting to a mental health service health service at the university, disproportionate amount of those are being discovered as actually presenting with problems with ADHD. More in the way of anxiety and internalizing problems are associated with college students with LD ADHD. Unfortunately, any causal relationship between that high rate of comorbidity isn't really well understood. The majority of our research is dedicated to the pediatric population. There's very little that's being driven to adults. College students with ADHD, 45% require tutoring, 14% require more time to achieve their actual degree, and a third of those are actually receiving mental health services above and beyond medication maintenance. Now, we're going to skip through characteristics of medical students with learning disabilities. Brinkerhoff provided a study that gives you a synopsis of what is typically problematic in this population. I'm not really keen about these kinds of summary studies. In the population that I've been working with here, I find diverse heterogeneity. And this kind of grouping is presented to you because it's an example of what's in the literature, but I wouldn't agree that this is going to be prototypic. It's replicating what we see in the Dartmouth. Well above average IQ. He's identifying strong in sciences on MCATs, weaker in reading. Good verbal conceptual abilities, but weaker reading comprehension. Associated difficulties with handwriting and characteristically poor spellers. In terms of the nature of the disability, some additional baggage that comes along is that these were always students who were achieving good grades but never did well on high-stakes standardized tests. They were growing into their LD. As the curriculum demands expanded and more in the way of self-directed learning was required of them, that's when they began to hit the wall and be identified. They don't perform well under pressure. They tend to be disorganized students. In the affective domain, there are some definitive factors that I think represent risk factors for you to be looking at when you're interacting with students in academic jeopardy. These are students who are fearful of being identified as marginal. After all, I was smart enough to get into med school. I have an ego to sustain here. But as they encounter that vicious cycle of stress, failure, marginal academic performance, these are the ones that are withdrawing. They don't ask for help. They are increasingly self-isolative, and 2/3 of these students are actually being seen by Mark Miller for the management of dysthymia and depression. To summarize, research on adult disabilities has grown exponentially in the last 10 years, but it pales, it's paltry in comparison to what we know about children. Most of our research is based on college students who are volunteering in their psychology classes. So if we're really moving beyond having an understanding of LD across the adult population, we're horribly skewed in the direction of only understanding baccalaureate students. But that kind of puts us in the catbird seat for trying to understand the needs of medical students. Now, let's begin to talk about reading disorders. Traditionally, we're talking about a term dyslexia. DSM does not use the term dyslexia. Dyslexia is actually a very finite deficit in decoding ability. It's defined by a youngster who can't make sound symbol associations, taking letter and letter blends and associating that with an actual sound. So the core of dyslexia is the inability to crack the code. But we're dealing with multiple dyslexias. That's why the term dyslexia is reserved mainly for the child who can't crack the code. But as we're going to see, there are multiple factors that can contribute to what is ultimately the goal of reading: taking lexical material and understanding it. So we're going to be moving from the code cracking single word ability to taking mass text and making sense of it. So what we're seeing is dyslexia's reading disorders actually divide along two basic lines: the child who can't crack the code, or the child who can reasonably read but not understand what they're reading, and the mixed subtype that is deficient in both of those areas. When we're looking at college students, we're going to be seeing that these are individuals who have been able to achieve a reasonable level of success in reading. They are compensated. But adults who are poor readers, although they may show average phonological awareness, decoding skills, especially where speed isn't being stressed, nonetheless, they're likely to have problems with drawing inferences and reading with comprehension and mastery. Those basement skills are holding them back. What I want to try to differentiate for you is the factors that can contribute to reading as a function of age can vary significantly. If we're dealing with pure dyslexia, we're dealing with the lavender, core deficits in phonological processing. As the student ages and becomes more successful with basic reading, the lavender is going to recede. Okay? But in first and second grade, kindergarten, that's the most prominent factor that we're going to be looking for to differentiate those youngsters that are at risk from those youngsters who are not at risk. Second major factor is language. So here's where, even though the child may have, through intensive intervention, achieved reasonable decoding skills and word identification skills, to the degree that higher level language processing is a burden, is going to limit the capacity for comprehension monitoring. So we've got to look at this bidirectionally. Bottom up, phonological decoding, cracking the code, sequential analytic, or top down. How can I bring language awareness, metalinguistic awareness, my semantic abilities, how can I bring them to bear to help me with reading? Now, another factor that is contributory is working memory. To decode multiple syllables, you have to hold that information in working memory, match it with a semantic code for a whole word, and recognize, oh yeah, it's not streptococcus, it's streptomycin. you're stressing working memory. To translate text, you're holding an enormous amount of information online, making reference to what does it mean, where's the author going with this, how does this relate to what I just read? Enormous demands on working memory. So those youngsters that are carrying burden in working memory, short of actual ADHD, can be significantly disadvantaged as well. Key factor I want to impress on you is how small the slice on visual processing is. Typically, dyslexia was associated with letter reversals, visual perceptual problems, and if you look at what's opened up in Market Square, a chiropractic reading disability clinic that's stressing visual skills, ladies and gentlemen, it's a language processing disorder. Only 3 to 5% of the variance is associated with a visual problem. If you go to the American Academy of Pediatrics, a position paper from 2011 critically debunks visual therapy. Yet these practitioners, optometrists, are getting $3,000 a pop to do 15 weeks of intensive training that is basically placebo. So I can get off my soapbox and we can talk a little bit more about compensated learning disability as it's likely to be manifest in medical students. And here we have to thank Sally Shayowitz. At Penn, her and her husband are two of the foremost imaging researchers in learning disabilities. And Sally has an excellent book that describes the identification and remediation of dyslexias. She states the hallmark of dyslexia is an unexpected deficiency in phonology and reading in relation to the person's other cognitive and academic abilities. The diagnosis of dyslexia at any age is not about magical formulas, a cutoff between your IQ and your level of performance on a standardized achievement test. Rather, it's understanding how this phonological deficit has the potential to impact you at this stage in your work or academic development. Older dyslexic students rely on neural systems that are different from typical readers. What results is they become proficient readers, but not at the level of fluency of normal readers. This, she explains, why traditional tests that are used by many school psychologists hold no relevance for high-level students. They're going to look perfectly good on tests that are only screening for word recognition or simple close procedures. The largest land-based mammal on Earth is the blank. Those kinds of tests are going to be passed with shining colors by reading disabled medical students. Key factor. Reading problems in older individuals are characterized by slow and laborious reading and writing. It's only when we ask these students to read aloud that we are going to expose their deficits. Slow reading in the face of high levels of academic achievement represents to Shayowitz evidence of residual, encapsulated phonological weakness. So, students like med students with a learning disability are expected to read more, understand more, but are held back by the incredible amount of time that this takes. So we cross a threshold, especially in my experience with engineering students who didn't have to do a lot of reading but go into medical school and are crushed by the sheer amount, the voluminous reading that they have to do. Literally, they don't have the energy to go through these things. She goes on to stress, lack of fluency is the only true index of dyslexia in an older individual. Our problem is DSM does not recognize this core deficit. So what we end up with is, using that kind of criteria, many of our students are not being recognized as eligible. What goes into assessment? Typically, a school psychologist is going to administer an intelligence test, and that's going to give us 4 factors that relate to the information processing strengths, weakness, how do they contribute to reading problems. There's a series of tests that are listed there. Their names are meaningless. The idea is that we've got a lot of flux depending on the age and the contextual demands in which the student functions, we're going to vary those tests to give us ecological validity, give us a sense of how our functional reading problems likely to be encountered. Discrepancy analysis was the guiding principle. We're going to end up with a summary score in an area of academic functioning, and we can match that with whatever that student's IQ is. Well, the mean is 100, the standard deviation is 15. Armchair diagnosticians in the audience, what do we have here? Obviously, we have a reading disorder, don't we? It's pretty easy. Well, in the assessment of a reading disorder, we want to not only we need to compare our students under 3 levels: relative to general norms, relative to your own level of functioning, and relative to your performances across the underlying neuropsychological skill set that defines your learning problem. So what we can do is graphically present this very, very easily. Here's our set of academic skill measures, and here are a set of scores. Again, we're identifying an individual that is clearly functioning below the average range of ability. Between average is 90 to 109. You can see those bars, for the most part, are below where they're supposed to be. Inference, probable learning disability. Well, let's now identify that student's IQ. This is a student with an IQ of only 88. That student is functioning at a level that is perfectly on line with expectations. Hence, it's not a learning disability. That individual is functioning at their given level of ability. But when we're looking at a student with an above average IQ, the disparity is glaring. So here we are clearly dealing with a learning disability, but what else do we know? We've only got a label, nothing more. So naturally, the National Academy of Neuropsychology, in order to give me a job, is going to lay claim to the stake. IQ and achievement testing is alone insufficient. In order to guide targetable interventions, brain-based, evidence-based targetable interventions, we need to know something more about brain functioning. So, a typical neuropsychological evaluation is going to involve the things the school psychologist would do: IQ, achievement, a neuropsychological battery, and to address comorbidities, measures of temperament, coping style, adaptational skills. So it's against these dimensions that we are literally going to explode the IQ. So we're going from 4 factors to more factors than you want to count. There's some debate on should we only address targeted assessment or should we use multifactorial assessment. Fletcher, an eminent neuropsychologist, is arguing for a minimalist approach that is related to RTI, response to intervention. Response to intervention is with what No Child Left Behind has left us with, is a set of criteria that steer intervention for students that are underachieving. It's mapping a series of 3 steps that a school district has to go through in order to determine what degree of intervention is ultimately going to be needed. My point is that process in itself can take 6 months. When you get to the end of that 6 months, then you're going to refer to the school psychologist. It may take the school psychologist another 6 months to be able to respond. We have, in effect, in this process, lost a year. Ladies and gentlemen, critical periods still exist. Despite what psychology taught for a couple of decades, critical periods still exist. We have a window until age 8 to do anything meaningful about remediating phonological processing deficits. After age 8, it's a losing cause. So, to take this type of minimalist assessment that is simply allowing for direct intervention, Band-Aids, and ignoring the fact we need a full-blown assessment to give us an understanding of what's causing this so that we're not taking a shotgun approach, we're taking a pinpoint targeted approach to intervention. And it's this process that is crucial in identifying learning disabilities in high-functioning populations. The screening instruments, they're going to skip right past those. So it's not until we are charting functioning at a multifactorial level that we're able to determine where those deficiencies lie and how do we target interventions to intervene. The younger you are, the more we're going to be focused at the top of the graph. The older you are, the more we're going to be focused at the bottom of the graph. And in terms of the students that I've seen, it's really important to focus mainly on attention, processing speed, new learning and memory, and executive functioning. In terms of attention, if you could just imagine two buckets, two brains with two buckets inside. One bucket is small, one bucket is large. That bucket represents working memory. So, to the degree to which you are lecturing and the student with the large bucket has that capacity to absorb what you're presenting, he's in the catbird seat because he's sitting there processing that information. Well, just how does that fit? I wonder where you're going with that. How does that fit in terms of what you said 2 days ago? But the student with a small bucket is barely keeping up with you and things are beginning to splash out. Weak working memory. Now, unless that student is very adept at note-taking, and I want to assure you that students with ADHD find note-taking anathema, a lot of that critical information is splashing out and never being absorbed. Okay, so one problem at the attention level can be limited capacity. Another problem can be processing speed. Riding a bicycle, the faster you can pedal, the more tricks you can do. The slower you pedal, what are your elbows and knees going to look like? Pretty darn ugly. So the individual that can process information rapidly can, to some degree, make up for limited working memory capacity. Third level that we need to look at is picture Route 28, a bar, two lines with lots of information along there. And picture a vacillating curve, a sine curve, with wide-ranging amplitude. As long as our sine wave is inside those two bars, that person is picking up any information that was on the highway. But when that person is functioning outside the amplitude of our two bars, that's information that's critically being lost. Now, when you're going from your baccalaureate degree to med school, you're going from Route 28 to the Autobahn. There's more information being packaged and at a much higher rate. So, in terms of picture a spigot under the buckets. We've got a spigot with water running into the bucket. I've got a small bucket, but I can handle that flow. When you go off to medical school, it's no longer a spigot. It's a fire hose. And some days it feels like Niagara Falls falling on your head. Now, one more thing that we need to think about is executive managerial skills. Do you remember the Peanuts character Pigpen? The character with the dust cloud around him? Okay, med students with ADHD and executive dysfunction are like the Peanuts character, except instead of dust, it's facts. They have a tremendous amount of factual information that's available to them, but it was never successfully front-loaded. It's there. They don't know how they got it. It's there. But when you get to medical school, you better be a pretty darn effective front-loader. Simple analogy. Take me to a lecture on the Civil War. I'm not going to sit there and passively jot down notes. I'm going to take my paper, fold it in fours, one quadrant, Lincoln, Grant and Lee, soldiers in the trenches, soldiers back home. Extremely bright med students were little fact sponges. They never had to learn to take notes. Somehow, by osmosis, it just got in. And we see transition points. Middle school, high school, freshman year, graduate school. At some point, they are literally going to hit the wall. Their gifted rote memory is no longer going to be enough. So a critical factor in our assessment is in learning and memory. How much were you that rote fact sponge who is actually not an effective executor or you're not really an effective information manager. So, key point I want to really emphasize with you folks is executive functioning. Again, not good with cartoons. What I want you to envision is our little house. Basement functions, first and second floor attic. Basement functions, attention, sensory perceptual functioning. Just, am I alert? Am I oriented? Am I getting the information that's being presented in this lecture? First and second floor, modality-specific information processing. Spatial abilities, nonverbal conceptual abilities, verbal conceptual abilities. Are those equal, or are you stronger in one than another? And how significant is that difference? Those factors really aren't of major importance by this stage in the med student's academic development. But I would argue that the attic is. So we're referring to executive functioning now. These are metacognitive processes that regulate and control other cognitive processes. In 2006, Wolf wrote a fantastic paper about ADHD and college students. And in general, she was trying to decide what are critical factors that determine success in college experiences. And she listed these factors: planfulness, organizational skills, the ability to critically monitor your ongoing behavior, to be able to benefit from feedback, time management, task persistence. What's interesting is, prior to her development of this scale of what are these factors that contribute to college success, a few years before that, the Behavior Rating Inventory of Executive Functioning was created. Nice little 90-item behavior rating scale that we can give to our students. The first factor relates to executive functions that contribute to regulation of behavior and emotion. Second factor relates to metacognitive functioning. Initiate, working memory, plan, organization. Those features that Wolf was identifying as critical for success in any post-secondary academic adventure dovetail into what we define as neuropsychologists as executive function. Deficits in executive function exist hugely in ADHD. Along with the behavior rating of inventory, the brief, we want to also take a look at academic skills. The small c is an academic skill survey. It provides a number of ratings that are related to actual critical skills that you need to have in your back pocket that are solidly well developed. Using this survey, we can see if there is any glitches in your armor. The small c also focuses us on some liabilities that relate to the potential for study skill deficits to negatively impinge on you. Motivational factor, test anxiety factor, and features that tend to be endemic to ADHD. So, armed with the behavior rating inventory of executive functioning and armed with a small c, along with that cognitive thumbprint that we developed in our profile of neuropsychological strengths, weaknesses, we're in the catbird seat in terms of defining for that student where are your competencies, where are your assets, and what are those liabilities. In looking at executive functioning, I would make the argument to you that this is the key factor where we really need to focus. If you've made it this far, there's low probability of quote-unquote remediable learning difference intervention being meaningful for you. If there's any remediation to be done, it's probably in the area of executive function training. At Yale, Thomas Brown took 157 adults with IQs above 120. So think of the Dartmouth student again. Of those students, in terms of IQ mapping, across tests stressing verbal and visual conceptual abilities, they're in the top 10%. These are national merit finalists in terms of that portion of the IQ that actually looks at reasoning and problem solving. But there are two other factors that were in that IQ that relate to working memory and perceptual speed. Now, despite being as bright as they are, look at the magnitude of liability that they carry with them in terms of their ability to be an effective information manager. Look how attention and processing speed issues have the potential to literally pull the rug out from under them. When he took not only the IQ score, but the behavior rating of inventory of executive functioning and matched that with controls, the magnitude of impairment in individuals that are potential national merit finalists is incredible. So here are really bright people that sometimes can't punch their way out of a wet paper bag. Russell Barkley, one of the most famous spokespersons on ADHD, is a neuropsychologist who would argue that we need to reframe ADHD from a behavior disorder as defined in DSM to an executive function disorder. For ADHD combined subtype, we're dealing with problems with behavioral self-regulation, impulsivity, that top half of the behavior rating inventory of executive functioning. But the bottom half of the brief related to metacognitive functioning. And what he's arguing is if you have ADHD, you are likely to be 40% below your peers in terms of your ability to bring these kinds of functions to bear. So translate that to an age equivalency. If you're a 19-year-old freshman, you're walking in the door, hopefully, with executive skills of a 15-year-old, at best. So no wonder there's such a disproportional amount of early crashing and burning among ADHD freshmen. Even though they are academically talented, in terms of the executive functions that they need to be successful self-directed learners, critical weaknesses. And I think that same analogy needs to be adapted to students at risk in the medical school. One of my favorite quotes came from Martha Denkla, and when I'm working with kids, it's always fun to demythologize the lazy kid. We've taken the lazy kid and we've found a perfectly logical explanation for why he's not functioning at the levels that he is, why he seems to be the absent-minded little professor, why he's not working up to potential. Okay, let's look at ADHD really quickly. In DSM, we've got 4 subtypes: inattentive, impulsive, hyperactive, combined, not otherwise specified. We, as neuropsychologists, have tried to argue for a major shift in the understanding of ADHD from a behavior disorder to one of an amalgam of executive function deficits. Those arguments have fallen on deaf ears, for the most part, with DSM subcommittees. In terms of ADHD in adults, 3 to 10% carry ADHD. Of those individuals, between 50 to 80% will continue to exhibit ADHD symptomatology. Those with a combined type, impulsive, hyperactive, that tends to burn out with a function of time. But those same individuals are left with metacognitive deficiencies. And those with the inattentive subtype are more likely to carry ongoing burden. It's been concluded that at least 5% of Americans carry ADHD complicity. There is an argument that was made that ADHD cannot possibly exist if it wasn't diagnosed before age 7. Ladies and gentlemen, I defy anybody on this campus to show me any evidence that that committee had when they made that designation. There's not a piece of literature that says 7 is the magic cutoff. It's a lie. It was a decision by committee. And it's carried enormous burden for many, many youngsters as a result. Get off the soapbox, Greg. Okay, let's look at the tools that we're using for the assessment of ADHD. DSM gives us 18 criteria. Russell Barkley took those 18 criteria and put it on a Likert scale that measures severity. It allows us to look at inattention impulsivity and get a rough cutting score? Are you above or below? Are you significantly outlying in terms of manifestations of these symptoms? Because attention varies for everyone. I've seen it in your faces as you've been listening. But is it significantly outside the range so that we're talking about that student who's vacillating? It's a roller coaster ride for him to be in a lecture with you. Russell Barkley added an important dimension to adult ADHD diagnosis. We've got 20 years of literature that says a really nasty comorbidity in ADHD inattentive subtype is what's been pejoratively called sluggish cognitive tempo, slow cognitive processing. So he developed another 9 criteria that identify this. And again, this is hugely beneficial to help us understand burden in college students and to document need for extended time. Because, ladies and gentlemen, that is the most asked for, demanded, and critically analyzed accommodation that test reviewers look at. We've got another adult ADHD rating scale that allows us to really focus on what subtype are we dealing with. Inattentive, combined. And we've got the Brown ADD scale that allows us to critically look at how the executive dysfunction may be manifest in that student. So combining a Brown and a Brief really opens up that window of expanding our capacity to define metacognitive weakness. Because of the high degree of comorbidity that coexists with LD ADHD and adjustment problems, especially internalizing problems, when a student has not had a pre-existing psychiatric evaluation, we'll typically do something like an MMPI or a personality assessment inventory to assess for comorbid risk. So let's look at AD. We've been talking about LD in college students. Let's look at ADD in college students. Overall lower level of academic achievement, high rates of academic failure, lower probability of getting admission, not likely to complete a degree. Those students that are higher functioning literally leave a portion of the ADHD population in the dust. These are the students who carry less executive function burden. In general, these are students that are going to attain lower GPAs, experience more problems, and more likely to have been on academic probation. 2 studies are of relevance here. When an ADHD sample was compared to an LD sample and a normal control sample, what fell out as major burden? Executive function problems were distinguishing them from LD and ADHD. Similar study using complementary assessment, small C type study skills, executive dysfunction, again being identified as a critical deficit. The majority of these risk factors come home to nest in one place: executive dysfunction, executive dysfunction, executive dysfunction. With ADHD, how do we intervene? Typically with medication. And in those students who respond to medication, we get a terrific reduction in classic distractibility, impulsivity, etc. But my argument is those aren't the students you're seeing in medical school. You get an 80% positive response to ADHD when you're dealing with combined impulsive hyperactive type. Studies of outcome have shown 30 to 50% efficacy when you're dealing with inattentive subtype. So in a lot of instances, it can be below 50%. With the risks associated with side effects, sometimes it's not helpful. There's more risk associated with carrying the side effect profile. And our problem is that the medications really don't do anything for the executive dysfunction. The medication doesn't help you unlearn bad habits. It may make you a more effective consumer of remedial intervention or accommodation, but it alone won't self-correct for the burden that you've been carrying. Another critical factor is when we're looking at medication, we need to be looking at substance abuse in college students. It's alarmingly high. Key factor is at the bottom. This is just a couple of months ago. Annals of Clinical Psychiatry found that 50% in a single medical school, 15% of third-year students were using psychostimulant medications. That's almost twice the utilization rate in the typical college population. So this group, under serious stress, is finding ways to get psychostimulant medications. Surely those 15% don't have ADHD, but they're finding a way to obtain and use psychostimulant medication. So that forces me as an assessor to make sure I'm using symptom validity measures to make sure that we're not finding a student that's attempting to fake bad in order to acquire medication. Psychosocial interventions for ADHD. Unfortunately, there are no real studies that document efficacy. One of the most popularized interventions has to do with coaching. Put simply, this is like having a surrogate set of frontal lobes beside you. An individual who is helping you to scan what's going on, what are your priorities, what do you need to get through this. And that individual progressively weans themselves from interaction with you, and hopefully you have absorbed some of those skills. Cognitive behavior therapy. We've talked a lot about the high rate of comorbidity for ADHD, LD, and internalizing behavior problems. One of the most effective forms of psychotherapy is CBT for those conditions. And guess what? It works well with ADHD in adults. There are now 3 textbooks that specialize exclusively in how to take cognitive behavior therapy techniques and adapt them to executive function interventions. But where in Western Pennsylvania do we have a clinician that's schooled in this? We haven't caught up with it, unfortunately. In terms of treatment, a combination of medication and cognitive behavior therapy would seem to be ideal. To the degree to which executive dysfunction is clearly documented, we need coaching, mentoring, and specialized academic support. Let me skip ahead because I see I'm running out of time. You can see what conventional accommodations are. MAPU provides a classic set of typical accommodations that are applicable to any medical school. But let me talk to you about what seems to be most critical and what stands up to the litmus test. This is Falcone versus the University of Minnesota. This was a third-year medical student who had benefited from all of these supports during his first 2 years. Flunked a lot of tests, was given the opportunity to redo those tests. Med school bent over backwards to help that student. But in his third-year clerkships, he was floundering, and he was dismissed. He attempted to sue the medical school for discriminating against him and discharging him. The 8th District Court found that these were all perfectly reasonable interventions. So if we're looking at typically what can we offer in terms of accommodations, that menu that was provided to you from MAPU is synthesized down to these major factors. Okay. Extended time is the most sought after accommodation for any college student or medical student. How do we establish this? Very easily. The Nelson-Denny Reading Test, NDRT, it can be administered in 2 different formats, a standard 20-minute format or an 60% extended time, 32 minutes. 7 passages, college-level literature, 38 questions that are not only fact-based, but require inference and generalization. Were you able to finish the test in the standardized mode? Yes or no? How many were left undone? What was your accuracy for that portion of the exam that you were able to complete? Now, if I give you that test with the 60% additional time and you were able to show substantive improvement over your base rate standard, it's inarguable. You're going to qualify for extended time. My argument is that in DSM, especially 5, they have come up with cutting criteria that you have to be substantially below average ability. That means a standard score of 85. How many of your students are going to come in and function below a score of 85 on any of my tests? None. So in effect, they have set up an incapacity on my part to provide objective evidence that allows for academic support extended time. The only way I'm going to be able to fulfill that argument is to attack on the information processing deficits that are impaired. So DSM-5 isn't doing us much of a favor. It's a bit obstructionist from my point of view. Again, Slomka off the soapbox. The remainder of that discussion really focuses on legislative mandate and the whole concept of the average person. What a medical student is going to have to demonstrate to a review body is that despite being exceptionally bright, I have glitches in my armor that significantly interfere with my ability to function and learn. In 2008, the ADA was revised by Congress because of a lot of really contentious court decisions that made very ambiguous the capacity for a test review body to determine, are you disabled or do you carry some degree of lag? In 2008, that language was incredibly liberalized, and it allowed for us to make the argument for your student qualifying for a disability under the label of learning in general, or any of those specific information processing deficits. So we do have a safety valve, but it requires a full neuropsychological evaluation. Is there anything else that I want to... Everything in there that is relevant for disability determination, you can read at your leisure.